Do you have a favourite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show author, traditional witch, and fellow southern Tasmanian, Lee Morgan. Because we're basically neighbours, we recorded our chat in person at Lee's mountain lair. So there's a bit of room sound in this one. It's nothing too distracting and, a small price to pay for the face-to-face dynamic, but it's nevertheless worth mentioning at the top of the show. Enjoy. Lee, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Yeah, welcome indeed. We're actually recording this in person in Lee's property well, we're kind of all Soho now, south of her, but I was going to say you're in the valley as well, but you're valley adjacent.
Yes, yeah, we are. We're up a bit higher.
Yeah, well, still the army grows. It's amazing. All right, so we have a traditional first question, Lee.
Okay.
And I'm actually rather interested in your answer to it.
Okay.
Were you a weird kid?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that I was. I was very quiet, I would say, and probably a bit older than my years with how I was described by my elders. It's an interesting question there.
Yeah.
Like, really? I think essentially childhood is a little bit, for a lot of magical practitioners, like a thing that you have to get through before people can start taking you seriously. I think a lot of things, were quite switched on early on, but I couldn't actually do anything with them because I was a kid.
So, such as what? Dream experiences or that kind of stuff? Spirit encounters?
A little bit, but not as much as you'd imagine necessarily. But there was a couple of, impactful things. I touched on them in A Deed Without a Name, but anonymously under all of those, anecdotes that people talk about their first awakening experiences. And there was only one or two, but it was enough to make me see that there was more beyond this world that was waiting for me if I found a way to break back on through. It always seemed like a fourth wall on reality that was, quite permeable, but I didn't yet have the key. That's how I would describe it.
So that's a really good description of it. I mean, what were some of those instances that made you realise there was something there? Did you grow up in a haunted house? Did any of that kind of stuff happen where you're like, okay, so this is quite the world is quite explicitly, I will eventually call this magical. Like, was it anything like that, or was it just the general life way of Lee as a kid?
Not really like that. It was quite mundane in the sense that I lived for most of my childhood in a suburban area with no real history or hauntings or anything. It was quite devoid even of trees, let alone like hauntings. But nonetheless, something broke on through at one point where I got up in the middle of the night, just had this really strong push, that I had to get up. It was almost involuntary, and I walked to the back door, opened the curtains, and there was a couple of what I would now consider to be spirit beings, clearly not human, standing looking at me. And I think I waved to them. Like, how sometimes you wake in a dream state and you don't respond to things in the way that you normally would. You don't go, oh, that's unusual. You just treat it all as normal. And then I must have gone back to bed, but I have no memory of going back to bed. And in the morning, the curtain was still open, and it was always shut at night, so I knew I had actually physically got up. That was sort of the start.
That's borderline UFO, Lee. That's quite good.
Well, my father certainly would say so.
Yeah. So this key you speak of, I mean, what was your... Tell us, if you kind of had that awareness, do you have a memory of the first time you realised that something like magic or witchcraft, like, exists? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
wait, this is a real thing?
Yeah. Well, I realise now as I look back on it that the time that I spent in England growing up, I was surrounded by superstition and spirit beliefs, but because they were couched in terms of saints and things like that, I had no immediate recollection of thinking that's magic. But at some point when I was about 15, I came across my first awareness of books and things on witchcraft and the occult, and I remember thinking, oh, there's people other than me that feel this. And I was initially a bit disappointed with what I uncovered, though, because a lot of it didn't match up with this, internal blueprint I think that I had already for what witchcraft should be. It was what I found was quite new age. And it took me quite a long time to circle back to those sort of superstitions and local things in the land there where my family came from, to realise why I was disappointed that it was something that was actually embedded in that older folkloric current that didn't come across as, quite so new age, I suppose. It wasn't generic, it was very place-oriented. And that was, like a circling right back to origins sort of thing, and starting to actually explore and ask questions of older people. And I was also helped by meeting some people a bit later in my teens who identified as being traditional witches, and as soon as I heard that there was something else outside of what was immediately visible in Llewellyn publications and stuff, I instantly knew why I felt elated and then disappointed when I discovered that the other people thought, that witchcraft was real.
So that rather begs the question, especially that's a really good articulation of not just your journey, but I think a journey that the broader magical world has been on over the last couple of decades, in that quest for situational context and authenticity, inevitably in some of the last places you look. But that does beg the question when you encounter people in your teenage years who identified as traditional, which is the endlessly open question: how would you define traditional witchcraft? Like, if
it's inevitable, that question, isn't it?
Afraid so.
I think that's why my first book was called The Deed Without a Name, because I actually do feel that there is something in the essence of witchcraft which is unspeakable and pre-verbal, that goes back to something which is very of the body, I guess, is how I would describe why I struggle to define it. It's not impossible to define, but it certainly is harder, I think, than a lot of people really acknowledge when they launch off into the intrepid description of what is witchcraft and what makes witchcraft traditional. I think it touches on some of the things that you talked about in one of your books in terms of there being a grandfather and grandmother current. Not to gender witchcraft as such in that regard, but in terms of there being a less written about, more, a type of magic which is absorbed, not just taught. And I think when people go out to try to verify traditional witchcraft, like when someone says that they have a source of some kind and people start trying to, hammer that down in time and space and find sources and talk to relatives and everything, I think they miss a little bit of something of the essence of it, because it is a really tangled mixture of transmission, but also I very strongly believe that people catalyze each other through things other than explicit lessons and stuff.
Sure.
That there is a passage of witchcraft between people in an almost infectious sense, particularly in families. And for me, obviously, you could say all the very simple things like it's trance-based. There's a very large emphasis on the visionary capacity. And yeah, as I say, I really think that it travels between bodies in a way that is defiant of logic. in a lot of ways, and it's always going to be uncanny. No one is ever going to be able to find a perfect proof or a perfect transmission story. I think we look for that naturally because there are people out there who've been fraudulent and such. But at the same time, I think it's a fruitless search. I think witchcraft messes with you in a way at that level, like it almost has a trickster element to it.
Well, that's actually a really good non-definition, because I think you're correct in the sense that you do have to embark upon that the project of defining by opening with, like, this is essentially impossible to define, and it is the pre-verbal and the embodied components to it are there. But also, and we were kind of joking before we hit record about some, one of my favourite terms, McKenna quotes, if it's real, it can take the pressure. There's something, if it is real, and it is, and if it is in some sense alive, then it will respond. It will infect in a bodily sense, but it will also pick up things along its own route. It doesn't, it cannot be reductively linearized to 100% satisfaction. You can find its traces in both history and historiography, but you can find it in other stuff as well. So you will have documents that go back, coming documents from like 18th century or whatever, right? That is one artifact frozen in time, explored in the Enlightenment context of how we do history. And that document had a family. That document was associated with it. And where I'm hoping we get to from... I mean, I have fewer dogs in this hunt, obviously, but where I'm hoping we get to in a traditional witchcraft definition sense is a bit more of the defining via non-defining, rather than, as you say, pointing to... especially as it gets, there is a high degree of fraud in some of the historic claims, like going back to that idea of it being like, well, it goes back this far here, and then here with my great grandmother in Italy, and then this, and then this, and then this, and you go, it's I don't know, it's not a bureau that you inherit, right? Like it seems like it's more analog than that.
I definitely agree. I think people are hungry for stories of origin because they're after a sort of myth of descent, like a mythic kind of story of how what they have came to be with them. I don't know that people consciously realise that when they go out seeking for what, chasing the paper trail, so to speak. But I think really that's at a sort of feeling level what people really want is to be rooted in some kind of continuity, some sense of origin, or that, and I think that exists. I think that it's just a little slipperier.
The messiness is part of the continuity. That this seems like, it seems sort of obvious to me that if you are looking for the continuity, funnily enough, the quest and the messiness and the trickster component actually absolutely is part of it. Particularly if you do want to go back to historic eras where you will have cunning folk competing for business or what have you. Like, they're going to be making claims themselves. Yes. And that's the story of magic. And you look at the grimoires and, King Solomon did not write this book. So both lineage and claims of lineage are part of the lineage, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they are. And even... ones that have been found to have some holes in them and stuff like that, I don't necessarily discredit the entire body of work on the basis of that. I think there is... Unfortunately, it comes down to some very fuzzy logic kind of things of there is a feeling. There is a feeling present in something which is legitimate that I can't really describe entirely, but I think if it's there... You can imagine that perhaps people have embellished their stories and such without it necessarily meaning that there was nothing to begin with, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
And there's a few people like that. I wouldn't want to necessarily name names because I wouldn't want to particularly living traditions and stuff. I think even when people have looked into some of those stories and not all of it checks out, I don't think it necessarily... I mean... but that's my take on a lot of things. I don't believe in making hard and fast judgments on things that I'm not initiated into. I sort of feel like I don't know what they've really got behind the scenes, so I tend to be a bit leery of that. But I do sense something different in something that I think has some connection to that past. But it's not like cunning folk and witches were not considered to be the same thing initially, and yet now, today, we have quite a fusion of material that seems to have come from cunning sources, and this underlying aspect of witchcraft, this thing which was considered to be in the teeth of everything, really. Like, if you look further back in history at what witchcraft originally was meant to be, it's not just anti-establishment, as many people would now like to paint it. In some ways, it's sort of a reversal of the things that people usually like in life, such as like abundant crops and things like that. Often there is a stealing of virtue from things, and cunning folk actually trying to take back the virtue that has been taken from, you know, an area or something like that. And I think that's very interesting that now what we're calling traditional witchcraft seems to evidence both aspects in some way of those two.
Do you think that's passingly interesting? Do you think that's interesting and promising, or do you kind of wish, at least from a practitioner level, we had some, maybe it doesn't work out, but like some firmer ontological boundaries to go, well, to be honest, yes, cunning craft was sort of like this, and witches appear to have been this. Do you think we would benefit from having
separating out?
Yeah.
I think some people do, but I don't. I think that what's happened there organically has meaning behind it. I think as humans we naturally want to maximise the things that make our lives more comfortable, and that kind of magic is always going to be something people copy down spells like from, you know, someone else that might aid in you know, bolstering the things that make human life better. But at the same time, very importantly, I think, and part of why we're seeing such a resurgence in people wanting to associate themselves with the word witch, is that we live in a time where increasingly we're recognising that what's good for humans isn't the whole picture, and that what is good for ecosystems and wilderness, and what is good for what people who view the world animistically might see as otherworldly forces, is just as important, if not more important, to the future goings-on of our species. And I think that people working on, you know, that current of seeing themselves as a witch, which currently, you know, can mean many things, but in the past distinctly meant a reverser, a person that like takes from the human world to give to something mysterious that isn't necessarily clear, it actually makes a lot of sense right now. I think as a species we have to acknowledge that there are keepers of balance that perform certain functions, and we might not like it, and that's too bad. It's not all about us upright apes and what we want out of life. There's a whole bunch of other forces and other things that we've come out of balance with, and maybe my humble suggestion would just be that maybe this resurgence has to do with that.
It's an immune response. We've been using that.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've been using that metaphor in the premium members for the most recent course about ancestors and the dead. And I think I'm happy that they're, you know, quote unquote cunning traditions and quote unquote historic witch praxis are returning and even blending at the same time, because the reality is we've lost both on a macro level, or, you know, at least for the last couple of 100 years, 150 give or take, and we need both back. So if they come back, they come back. Yeah.
And also, you know, one has to question how much that dichotomy that was created had to do with the religious framework of the time too, in terms of like trying to paint yourself as a godly practitioner of magic so as not to get killed. Yes. You know?
Yeah, I mean, that's the classic Peter Gray definition. You find a witch at the end of a pointed finger. And that is it. But I mean, and that's just, I have this, it's sort of died down of late, but over the last couple of years with a subset of the witch archetype as a sort of middle-class white feminist inspiration, I had some challenges with that standing in, obviously, because for one, it's racist, as standing in as like the macro idea of what the term witch is on a planetary basis, which I think is that kind of very Brooklyn-centric notion. It's certainly valid, and it's certainly a hugely potent archetype to interact with, but you miss the rest of the witch story around the world about that tension between practitioners, and sometimes you might be because you had to go out into the woods and do something bad, and then the next day you come in to open up your shack and do your herbalism, right? So there was a danger that I think we're kind of a little bit past of realizing that this form or this idea must necessarily contain multitudes, right up to the ones that I actually quite like are a lot of the historic accounts of witches bothering livestock or stealing children looks like UFO encounters. So it is words we used to describe the fact that we would use the word witch in some instances to not even be referring to humans, but to, as you say, the taking and assault on the human world for it to go somewhere else. So witch has to contain human and potentially non-human. And I'm quite excited that all of this is coming back, and I think we've sort of moved a little bit past the middle-class white attempt once again to co-opt the totality of the word and bring it into a planetary and more than human context. And I think, that's my witch rant.
That's a good one. I think a lot of it depends what the othered thing is in culture, and I think that as we reached a certain point, feminism and that resurgence of the feminine was a very othered thing in our overculture in some ways, but I think that now we're kind of moving into a time in history where we're saying that that's part of it. And I made an allusion to the whole grandmother traditions kind of thing, and I don't discount that at all from the spirit of witchcraft. I do think that, but it's a dwelling point of all of the things that are othered. It's quite many-headed and multifaceted in that way, and I think that's what we're seeing a resurgence of, is that the other isn't limited to
exactly. And that I view that as a broadly positive flowering of a return of all these things, and we just need to resist the double urge of not arguing on the internet and and also just overly defining, because we don't know what these, I just use the term archetypes, we don't know what these archetypes, they're on their way somewhere, they've got a plan or a mission, and we're along for the ride for part of it. So just try and resist over defining what these things are at this point. I would say is reasonably good advice.
And I think it also gives a bit of respect to the bioregional aspect of witchcraft too, whereas that there isn't an overarching, there's not many overarching, there are some, but not many overarching things you can say about it that respect the placeness of it, the rooted in place aspect of it. Other people's traditional witchcraft might not look like mine. And so I like to try to keep it, fairly simple in those definition terms, because, it is diverse.
And we're going to come back to this, because in your latest book you had some descriptions of a very familiar sense of growing up in Australia for me, which was that it's so emo, and I have better academic words for it now that I've gone through understanding post-colonialism sufficiently and all this kind of thing. But there is a particular malaise with being on country when you are quite recently not from it. Yes. And particularly for those who are sensitive. We were just talking about, animist bioregionalism or and an interest in differing heritages and so on. So tell us about that, because I read through that bit with I recognize this. What was it like growing up in Australia? From that perspective. I mean, I know a lot of it, BMX bikes and so on. I mean, from that kind of peculiar, because you sort of went on a very similar journey to me as a result of growing up here, I think. But,
yes, I think because my childhood was going back and forth a bit between England and Australia, we tended to go back every 3 years, that it pushed into very stark contrast the feelings that I had when I was on the place where my ancestors have been for thousands of years, to on this other place where I had a very strong sense of It's not so much that you're not welcome. I think that now I look back on that, a lot of that was in my head. I think it's the intellectual awareness of all of the heavy things that have transpired. And ever since childhood, I was very aware of those things, very serious and very, almost worried, I think, about what that meant spiritually to me. And I think because of that bioregional aspect, I really do believe in an ancestral imprinting where there's certain trees and certain environments that are kind of connected to your fetch, and you have that physical response to them. And the aridness of the part of New South Wales where I grew up was just completely in the teeth of that.
That isn't in the book, but that is exactly... And I look at it now, like, because my family are up the Hunter Valley and so on, so we'd be driving up there, and you're looking at farmland and semi-arid eucalypt trees, and I'm like, I hate this. It makes me thirsty and nauseous just looking at it. I can't cope. Now, with the benefit of 15 years away, I see it for what it is, and it's different, but it's stunning. But my God, did it look like I was not in the right place when that happened.
I can relate to that. I wanted to see its beauty, but I struggle because at some level I think I have such a deep ancestry in one particular spot in the West Country of England is so green and so soft, It's a very soft kind of feeling to be in that, well, in some ways. But, yeah, I think down here in Tasmania there is a sort of a kinder feeling in the land. Oh look,
this is the Goldilocks just right bowl.
Yeah.
from like a temperature. Usually, when it's not on fucking fire,
yes.
It has that kind of slightly fantastical blend that in the end I was looking for. I don't know about you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I too see the beauty in where I came from now too, but there was certainly a time of feeling locked out, of feeling the exile, wandering in the desert kind of feeling. On the mainland, and obviously my future was leading me down here.
Well, you told me about that. Tell us a version of how, in fact, you did end up down here, because it's rather good.
Okay.
I asked Avalon, my neighbour, this as well, because I'm trying to work out what's going on in southern Tasmania. We're attracting weirdos at a great clip.
We certainly are. Yeah, well, I reached a point in my life where there was a lot of options open to my partner and I at the time, and we could have gone anywhere in the world, really. And so, being who I am, I threw it open to a very serious divination with a large visionary capacity involved in it, and I saw a very distinctive place, and it was a city with a mountain behind it, and the mountain had snow on it, and I could see all of how it sat in relation to the coastline and everything, and it was locked in there. And then I just had to find it in the world, and I didn't actually think to look in Australia at first because of the mountain had snow on it, stupidly really, because there's plenty of mountains in Australia that have snow on them, but it didn't occur to me that a smallish looking city like that. I mean, you don't hear a lot about Tasmania really on the mainland. But yeah, a job came up down here, and I got on the internet and had a look, and as soon as I saw a view of the mountain from the city, I knew that was the mountain that I was looking for. So I came down here sight unseen, never saw it with my eyes and all of our possessions, and just made the leap. And I've never looked back.
There's, there's been a few places that I've either moved, same thing, sight unseen, or just visited, where you feel it when the actual wheels of the plane touch down. You go, I went the whole way down. Like, the whole way down into country, as soon as it went boop, and I'm like, yeah, this is it. Was it that, like, yep, that was a true vision I had.
It was, but I wasn't on a plane. I came across on the Spirit of Tasmania, and it was quite magical because we did the whole sleep on the boat thing, and at morning, there was a mist and everything, and it parted, and I saw my first glimpse of the land as we came in.
Excellent.
And I went, Oh my God, this is it. Yeah, I was here.
So those sort of capacities, that was our journey in January of last year, except we didn't get mist. We had the kind of summer sunrise, so you could kind of see it, the little lights of it. But anyway, this brings up, I'm going to jump my questions around a bit. I love this in the book, in the latest book. And we're kind of talking about it now, so we're jumping around a bit.
Sure.
What else, this is a leading question, obviously, what else should the site be called, and why?
The recognising.
Yeah.
The noticing.
The noticing is in the book.
I think that we get too site fixated, and I guess that comes back to my assertion that I feel witchcraft is pre-verbal at some level, that there is all of the senses wrapped up in an experience of the other world, and people get so fixated on seeing spirits, and particularly because in the media, like, it's often depicted as being able to see people as clearly as what you and I are sitting here now, and of course there are some people who experience that, but it can lead away from people not noticing the multifaceted nature.
Yeah. This is my grimoire tension, because there are extant techniques, including a mirror, where if you do these things, it will show up and it will look like a picture on a TV. Like in the mirror, that's fine. But simply because that happens doesn't mean that is the sole arbiter of spirit interaction or spirit presence. Mm-hmm. And so I just loved the difference, like kind of shifting the sight to, like, perhaps we should call it the noticing. The premium members have just gone through a magical geography course where we're kind of using that holistic sensing of interacting with the more than human world, and it is honestly, deceptively, I was about to say, it's honestly as simple, deceptively, as being in that kind of fuller awareness and interacting. And it's easier to do in quote-unquote nature to start with, as like your training wheels, but then you move that into the world and of your just normal life, and the noticing seems like a really good. I've appreciated that. The site should perhaps be called the noticing. That was fun.
I think paying attention to detail and noticing and paying attention is a huge part of magical training that often doesn't get enough airtime. I think that. I think it comes from anxiety, to be honest. I think most people are too wound up to be fully noticing. And I think that's why in nature it helps.
Yes.
Because you come down away from all that human-to-human anxiety and you start to settle. And when you settle, you start to notice with all of your senses.
I like that. Yeah, I'm quite sure that's a big component to it. The other bit that I think people, it's coming back to that getting too in your own head thing as well. There are expectations of, you get caught in your own head and in this infinite loop about what more than human interaction should look like. And when it doesn't look like the movies, you're like, I'm doing it wrong, and then you get caught in that loop. If you're out in a wilderness area, yes, those expectations are not necessarily there. You don't have the anxieties of human to human contact. But also, the plant is there. You don't have to summon it. And they're generally quite responsive, and humans have emotional reactions to them. I think it's the right kind of... And it is probably more significant than we could get to as to why it's the case that plant teachers are what they are. Do you know what I mean? Like, there is something metaphysically significant about the fact that you kind of have to be in the woods to learn this, at least at the beginning level. You don't have to always do it in the woods, but I always find interacting in the more than human plant world that it is almost counterintuitive that they are more interested in teaching than organisms that may more closely resemble us, like animals. And that's odd. Metaphysically, not odd's the wrong word, it is metaphysically significant that is the case.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it takes quite a humility as well for people to decenter the idea that advanced consciousness must come in a form that resembles us.
Yeah.
And I think along with ditching the anxiety in the body, and I don't just mean mental chatter, but the actual stored anxiety in the body, the next step to opening that is the humility to recognise that something which we have traditionally been taught to think of as a lesser life form may have an incredibly advanced networked intelligence that predates our own.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of the book, a great title. What's with tell us the title and how your latest book came to be titled, because I like it.
Okay, it's called Standing and Not Falling, a Sorceress Primer in 13 Moons.
So why Standing and Not Falling?
It's an Agrippa quote, and it's one that's always really spoken to me as inspiring. In some ways, I don't know, I felt in some ways that it was almost a problematic thing to call it, because a lot of the stuff that I talked about was actually about surrender, and people might not actually associate standing with surrender. But I guess anyone who's ever tripped and fallen over knows that it is better to be standing than falling at some level.
Well, so the surrender bit, the tension between the title and a lot of the content was why I think it's a good match. I think you're right, but that's why I think maybe it stuck with me.
Yeah. It was something that was shown to me quite early on as an inspirational quote by someone that I was in a kind of teacher-student relationship with, and it's always been one that's sort of, echoed in my consciousness, and I've always thought at some point I'm going to name a book that. I feel that it touches on the quote itself, that there's nothing that can't be accomplished essentially by the soul of man, standing and not falling. To me, it's kind of a many-layered observation. I mean, I don't posit that there is any entirely separate spirit of mankind or spirit of humankind. Like, I don't think we do anything alone. I don't think anybody does. So I don't sort of hold it up as that enlightenment idea of, mankind trampsing their will over everything else. But I do think that there is like a sweet spot, a certain kind of sensation maybe akin to surfing or, riding a horse or something, where there is balance required. It's not dominion, but it's balance. It's an ability to stay on top of a strong force. And I guess that's what the book's about in a nutshell, is I believe that witchcraft, and probably other forms of occult practice too, because I have purposely written this book to be usable for people that are of all different persuasions, that magic in general is like riding a horse or something quite powerful like a wave on the ocean, and that you can potentially go under that wave or fall off and be badly injured. I do think of it not as a safe practice, which is interesting, really. In a way, the book tries to make it a little bit safer. I guess we all try to give a hand up to the people, coming through where we might have fallen off, and such, to point out the hazards and ways that we can avoid falling.
You're kinder than I am. I just say it can destroy your life and it's a feature, not a bug. Move on. So why 13 moons? It just come to you as a sort of like, well, this is a good framework for a collection of sort of sequential praxis. Is that the general? Because it is,
Well, it's close to a year and a day, the lunar year sort of thing. I think it's the minimum amount of time that you can dedicate to something and actually get something out of it. Like, I don't think anything shorter would really have the desired effect that I was hoping that working through it would have for people. That's pretty much the reason. It's quite straightforward, I suppose.
I also like that, because that does tend to be the case, that if you have a book that is not just, but is in fact also a manual of some kind, right? I like that this one's quite generous with the amount of time. So if you look at something like the classic example being, say, Israel Regardie's 1 year manual or something, no one's doing that. No one's ever doing that, ever. Right? This one actually has the benefit of, because it is leisurely, like, split by, moons in that sense, and whilst the exercises are some of them are quite intense, like, you're not going to have to drop part-time at work
No.
to be able to do it. Like,
No.
you actually, this is one that you in fact can do should you feel so inclined.
Yes, and I did that because I wanted it to be complementary to other people's systems of working, where someone could pick it up and use it even if they were quite experienced, or a beginner could pick it up. I had a lot of questions after A Deed Without a Name of like, yes, that's lovely, but how do I actually apply that to my life? And that's very difficult when you're working in an initiatory tradition, because I can't actually give a great deal beyond that. So I thought to myself, how can I write something which answers the questions that I'd been receiving in my inbox without going too specific into my personal practice? And that was what I came
And
up
so
with.
for me, because I think I could see that, because the other thing I could see is that, and I have a couple of these in one of my books as well, is that in some sense a couple of the exercises are tricks. Like, they will work, but they will do a thing that will actually get you as the participant into the mode where you can answer or explore those questions yourself. It's sort of you kind of have to obliquely answer that, yes, but how do I do this? I'm like, well, try this, because in fact, if you get to the end of it, you will have that dream and place-based, you'll have the beginnings of like a dream and place-based interactivity that will allow it to flourish for you specifically wherever you are. And I could kind of see you sort of, I call it hiding the vegetables in the kids' food.
Yes.
And some of it, so that was fun to read through.
Oh, thank you for noticing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely there. I feel like you sort of have to do that, because witchcraft, in my view, is a bit different to other forms of magic in that, and this is a bit where I'm a bit harder on the whole, like, you know, you say I'm very kind to reach my hand out for people, but I do have a bit more of a hardline element on this, that I believe that some people are witches and some people are not. Mm-hmm. Everyone can practice magic, I think, if they work hard enough, I reckon, and they dedicate themselves to formulas that are pre-existing and they do the hard work. I think, virtually anyway, anyone can get some response if they're passionate and dedicated. But witchcraft is a bit different, and I think that if you followed the formula in that book and you tied it to some other occult tradition, or you came to it with the intention of following that, that would be fine. But if you're a witch, by the end of that, you would know. Like,
Yeah,
I think
sure.
if you don't know already, I think that you would know if you followed those formulae, because I think certain things would happen which would reveal that.
So I like this, because I'm 90% sure I agree with you that not everyone can be a witch, but magic is a kind of is a culture-specific way of using human capacities, right? So, like, everyone has them. So is it that witches are sort of further up the bell curve and are thus, like, by your definition, so they're better at something that everyone can do? Or is it different to that again? Like, are you going down a Stephen King line? Because I kind of have that with magic as well, where he says everybody can write, but honestly, only some people are writers. And if Stephen King says that, you've got to pay attention. And is it sort of like that? Or, I mean, how would you... Because I'm pretty sure I agree with you. I'm just not sure what the ontological boundaries of that would be.
I wouldn't make it hierarchical in saying that witches are better at it, but I'd say witches are different at it. I think there is a certain... I'm always going to use the word taint, which sounds a bit funny, really. A taint of the otherness that is carried by people who are marked as what we would call it for witchcraft, that they carry an intrinsic link to certain aspects of the other world, which is impossible for them to ignore.
Okay, so instead of a bell curve, although this sort of does sometimes follow it, like it's species distribution. So if magicians are... If the use of magic is trees as a category, a certain kind of tree is a witch.
Yes.
So it's that kind of distribution.
Yep.
So maybe we should use mushrooms and that would have worked better. But it's the same thing. In the fungal kingdom, magic is fungus and witches may be a specific
Yes. I think
Okay,
that's
I
a
like
good
it.
analogy. I don't like placing things in a hierarchy.
Sure.
With that sort of thing, I don't, because I don't know. I've never been anything else. Like,
But so
I'm always
this is-
very careful.
Well, so we are in
with that.
agreement. That's
Yeah.
where I'm like 90% sure I agree with you. I just needed to make sure it wasn't, and I don't think you meant it hierarchically, but I think there are other kinds of people. I think magical talent certainly is distributed along a bell curve because everything is.
Yes.
Tennis is, right?
Yeah, totally.
And you can get better at it with practice, but there are some aptitudes that are there. So, like, I just wasn't sure if you were defining all the people who are at the top of the bell curve, the pointy bit, as, well, they're witches and then there's everyone else. Because, like, I know, but, like, there are perfectly extremely hyper-competent practitioners outside of it. So, yeah, the
Absolutely.
ecosystem metaphor is better, isn't it?
I think so. I prefer ecosystem.
Yeah, all right, then we're in
metaphors.
agreement. It's good. Cool. One of the other things in the book that I thought was kind of lengthy and a fascinating exploration was shame and how shame can impact magic. And I mean, talk us through a little bit of that, because I thought that was that's definitely a discussion worth having.
Wow, yeah, it's a big one. I think.
Sure.
Hard to know even where to jump in.
Well,
with that.
it kind of something. I guess over the last decade, for me, I've been kind of fairly defiant at, and one of the ways I did this was by marshalling a whole bunch of empirical evidence from across near-death experiences and psi and all this sort of research that sort of, one, falsifies this sort of presumptive materialism that the world pretends to operate on, but two, like, the balance of evidence is on our side, that, like, however you wish to language it, spirits are real, life continues after death, etc.,
Yes.
etc. And so I have this sort of been on this 10-year defiance quest where I'm, quietly confident I could, even though mercifully they're gone from the cultural world now, but like I could out-debate any of those new atheists because I have the data, right?
Yes.
And so I went at it from an empirical angle, and I like that sort of argument. But it was in your exploration of shame and how it can impact magic, I could see the same thing there, which is, well, a different route to the same place, which is in one sense a defiance, and it's a defiance that certainly comes from turning around and looking at the ridiculousness of, like, well, why would I feel self-conscious in front of these idiots who are, I might be wrong, but they're definitely wrong. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And I really like that. So how do you think that, like, impacts the performance of magic? Like,
Well, shame's connected to the ego, in my view. It's connected to the exteriority of the self and the part which exists in social space, and I don't think magic has anything to do with that, which that's why it's probably not terribly natural for me to engage in self-promotion or talking about my magic, because to me there's a real disconnect between that, and I feel that shame is a social disciplinary tool which is used to keep us in a place, and one of the places that we've been told to inhabit is a non-magical framework, and I can remember even just like how I was saying that I was surrounded by superstition growing up, that it's really, really difficult to get my grandmother to talk about her superstitions because she'd been shamed. Like, she'd been told that she was uneducated and that she believed these things because she didn't know any better. And so, being an educated person myself who had 7 years of university education that I had to deconstruct, because in some ways it is a weapon, like, it can be brought out as a weapon. Like you say, you could debate these people on their own terms. If I cared to, I probably could too in some areas, but I feel in a lot of ways that it's only one weapon.
oh, sure.
It's only one way to deconstruct the meta-narrative of society, and a lot of it can be done in a quieter way of peeling off other people's narratives from the body, and the truth of our magic, as in witchcraft anyway, I'd see as coming from a very, what I would class as red, physical, fetch-based kind of place. Not just that, but, like, that's a big part of it. And shame has been used in so many ways to put everything into hierarchical organizations with, exterior over interior, and, ego over whatever else dwells within, which is not ego, the hidden, and logic over emotion and instinct and intuition. And there's so many shame-related things that we have to overcome to really delve into this practice, because unlike a lot of other forms of Western esotericism, it doesn't yield quite so well. I think where we started this conversation in the whole define it kind of thing, it doesn't yield quite so well to that debate-oriented kind of thing, which means you have to take a bit of a leap into a realm where you probably will be ridiculed, at some point you're bound to be ridiculed, and you've got to be strong enough in what you found by going outside the hedge and outside the world, that the human world, to come back into that strong enough to stand in front of that person who might ridicule you and say, no, I'm sorry, I can't argue that on your terms. This is a thing that exists outside of your terms,
Well, that's what I loved about it. I mean, quite clearly, and I've gotten over it. I mean, it took a decade, but and I only got over it to my satisfaction, accumulating like a mountain of data points, and then realizing, one, I have a nice dragon hoard of data points I can pull out for all kinds of stuff, but also that it's a subset within this sort of empirical framework, and empiricism is just one way of validating truth in the universe, right? Mm-hmm. So I really enjoyed your exploration of, one, how that can present, and two, what you can do to overcome it, because inarguably my first beginnings on that kind of accumulation of psi and parapsychological data a decade ago presumably came from a place of either shame or avoiding it, or seeking to prevent it, because if I am going to publicly do these things, I'm like, well, I might as well, and I might as well weaponize the fuck out of my arguing by having all these points. But so it was really interesting to kind of have a different light thrown on, well, what was the original impetus for that? Because I'd been practicing magic before I suddenly, decided to go and accumulate what I think is some very robust data points around after-death contact and all that. So I'm like, well, why did I do that? And I think in this book, I'm like, well, at least in part either because I experienced or was seeking to avoid experiencing shame. So there you go.
I think a lot of what we do in society is based on those things, and probably why people who are very immersed in practice, and particularly from a witchcraft angle, do come across as odd. And your first question was I a weird child?
That's my trick.
Well, children don't yet have all of the armour that's been built up. I hadn't yet gone to university and accumulated my own set of arguments. And I think when I came into writing a book, I did come in from the same angle. Like A Deed Without a Name has a lot of references, and I have been very careful to stay within the parameters that other scholars had established and things like that. There isn't a great deal of personal stuff about me or anything in it. And I think that, that represents, I suppose, a growth away from shame into like, this is what I do and what I am. I can't talk about all of it, but I can certainly show people that anyone who thinks that they are completely free of being accosted at some level by that culture of doubt and that empiricism inevitably builds is probably fooling themselves. Even if you've been doing it for decades and decades, it's still worthwhile to take a look at those things, because at the very least you might uncover that some of your own behaviour has been there to protect yourself.
Sure.
Your social self. And your social self at the end of the day isn't where the magic is going to happen, I don't believe.
No, agreed. And this kind of dovetails into the next question, because I enjoyed this. So what's your beef with the term UPG?
Oh, well...
You see how it's kind of related to the empiricism stuff, right? So
it is. And
for people who improbably, if you don't know this term, it's unverified personal gnosis. But anyway, carry on, Lee.
Yes. It's usually used scornfully, I think. And I find that kind of strange. And if you look at it from a logical angle, every single revelation that has been turned into a grimoire and tried and tested, and of course the tried and tested element is important, but still must at some point have gleaned its original origin from a personal gnosis experience. Where else do humans get...
This is absolutely the words we use, and it's funny when you say it's used scornfully. The surprise, I really enjoyed that kind of departure, or not even really a departure, but that, like, I have a bunch of problems with this term, as do I. One of them is you are, whilst it can get more intense, like, I think it is useful to kind of consider the imaginal and the spirit world to essentially be identical for the purposes of epistemological examination, right? So it's about elevating the idea of the imaginal back to where it has historically been, which is this whole big idea. But when you say it's used scornfully, it's used self-scornfully. It comes back to the shame thing. Like, you'll tell people, like, this is a bit UPG, or this is just some UPG, and you go, well, that was an eruption from the imaginal into your experience, and I don't mean your head, I mean into your full embodied experience, and you just called it that?
Yeah, people
is there a better term?
To be self-deprecating, but what are you really deprecating? You're actually, like, making out that something which passed to you from the spirit realm is lesser somehow than something else that might have been written down for longer. That's a bit insulting. I don't know if I was the spirit whether I would come back and say anything else after that. I'd just call it inspiration.
Exactly.
I don't have any other term for it than that. I mean...
And that's again about elevating, and I love this, right? Like, that's again about elevating the status of the imagination and the status, or the imaginal, and the status of inspiration in your interpersonal discourses. And that's with either other human practitioners or just, like, life in... If you're in the woods and you have... And if you're, the artist formerly known as UPG, pay fucking attention. You're in the woods.
Yes.
How else is it going to interact with you? You know,
exactly.
I mean, a bunch of biochemical ways, etc. But, like, that is the spirit to spirit interaction. If you go, that's a bit weird. Best get back to the car now. Like, what are you doing?
I mean, that's the interactive point. I mean, obviously I believe in the importance of tried, tested and true.
Clearly.
Because otherwise I wouldn't be involved in something calling itself traditional, you know? I mean,
sure.
Clearly I believe things build up a certain kind of faster access over time if they've been used, like, quite a bit. We would call that reddened. Like, it's accumulated virtue in some way. It's like a worn pathway between this world and the next. I totally believe in that and see it and work it. But... a living tradition, something which isn't calcified, has to involve the potential for continuous interaction with the other world. You can't just shut a door at the 19th century and say, oh, well, this was traditional back then and now nothing will ever come through again. Otherwise, why the hell are you even practicing magic if you don't actually wish to receive anything?
Get a more satisfying hobby. Exactly.
Yeah. And it doesn't shut the door on questions of quality. I mean, it's no different than reading a poem by someone who is a gifted master and something that someone's written a very bad doggerel poem to their cat or something. Everybody can, well, any sufficiently, person with a refined aesthetic sensibility can tell the difference between the two. And I think that it is aesthetic. Like, I think the place of the aesthetic exists in not just a visual, obviously, aesthetic, but that whole, the way we appreciate the arts is the same way that you can appreciate the difference between a so-called UPG that has something behind it of, the numinous, and something which might be coming from someone's ego.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've all read those things.
Clearly.
It's just screaming the person's ego.
Yeah.
And it's a sensibility that you have to build. You can't just slash the whole practice. You've got to build that sensibility to recognise the presence of the real deal.
And the presence of the real deal is something we were talking about before we hit record, as we're here in your lovely house, is speaking of aesthetics. There's some really fascinating and useful exploration of what the home of a practitioner should and shouldn't look like, and it's almost like the low quality UPG is the the accumulated dragon tat and so on that kind of screams a very surface layer interaction with symbols. But I mean, how there's some really one, personally useful, but two, I mean, let's have a discussion about what the inside of what the inside of a practitioner's house should look like, and also from a practical perspective, like what are some good warding things that don't require you to go to your local big box hardware store and buy like 5-foot angels and stick them at the bottom of the driveway. Like, what are some? I mean, if they were kind of goth enough with lanterns, maybe I probably would. But I mean, talk us through how, as I understand it, or I'll say it this way. I think you can, coming back to the aesthetic, get an indication of the priority a practitioner will place on the imaginal, or the seriousness with which he or she will take the imaginal, by how you will find things like their house or their property or whatever arranged and what it contains. Do you know what I mean? There is that sensibility. So talk us through that.
I guess it comes back to the ego thing for me, because I think you can tell the difference between someone who's tried to set their house up to look oogity-boogity and they're collecting things that they think give off the notion that they're a witch, as opposed to people who've set up their house as a living organism which is full of things with virtue in them that have internal meaning for them and in order to display. I think that to me is one of the things that I would smell out if I was in someone else's house. It's not so much about what it looks, it's about what it feels like. The objects, like in a witch's house who is not being driven by the display urge, is coming from like a deeper kind of place. The objects have like an animistic presence, and they're there because of that. They're not there to impress someone. And to me, that's a very obvious distinction that I can almost say I could smell it. Hence the whole noticing as opposed to sight. Like I utilize other senses when I talk about an aesthetic. I don't think that there is a visual, although many people spend a lot of time cultivating a visual aesthetic on Instagram and stuff, and I don't necessarily disparage that. Some of the things are very beautiful to look at. I don't mind them, but I wouldn't know what their value was from looking at them on Instagram. I would have to be in the house and actually feeling them with all my senses to know what level of heft I thought they carried. Because the house is a macrocosm of the personal persons that live in it, and it has all kinds of entry points to the other world in it, set up through things that appear to just be objects but exist in more than one plane of reality, I guess. So
how would people, because it's fairly easy on the internet to find some, for better and for worse, 101 like house warding or house protection stuff, but the way it's explored in the book, and especially in a kind of animist elevation of the imaginal sense, how do we look again, based on what you just said, and give this as sort of practical suggestions for people? What is the process of, if they're sitting in their homes right now, thinking like, have I done that? Are there optimal ways? How do I begin the process of interacting with this macrocosm? Like, what does warding and interaction look like now that I've heard this?
Well, I guess it's multidimensional. I don't think there's any one charm that protects a house or property. I think that it starts all the way from your connection with the country that you're on and the spirits of place. I mean, you have to build that. If you've built up that connection in the place, there's spirits around that would warn you if something wasn't right. I've had people even be reluctant to walk over my threshold and stuff like that, and they don't know why, but it's coming from every layer. It's coming from the underworld beneath and the presence of my own ancestors' relics and things like that. It's coming from the actual green realm and the connection with the trees and plants of the place, and it's coming from the way that the hearth has been maintained, like the importance of the fire as a place of interaction with the dead. There's numerous I suppose I'd tick it off in layers, I guess. I would say, like, exactly. How do you enter the underworld at that site, and what connections are there with the dead? What connections are there with the spirits of nature around you? Do you feed the spirits of your dead at a certain place, and do you have, like, connections with that and your thresholds and stuff? Because you want to look at a house like a body. It's got openings the same as we do, and each of those has to have something going on at it, otherwise it presents a weak point. And a lot of the things that keep that kind of connection up are to do with interactions between your body and the place. Like, you often see midden piles and stuff under old houses where people have put bits and pieces of their broken crockery and broken shoes and stuff like that, and there's like that give and take between your fetch and the house, where it's slowly accumulating, bits of you. And I think, people think about warding in terms of what herbs do I need to hang this bag up or something like that, but unless you've been pissing on your boundaries for a really long period of time, and you've been sort of like because you're putting yourself into the place and taking the place into you, it's an incomplete process. Like, it has to happen physiologically over time, and you can utilize those kind of things, the traditional sorts of things that protect boundaries, and there's nothing wrong with any of that. But I think it's a much more profound...
The layers thing is good. It's the difference between having a healthy immune system and taking an antibiotic. Like,
yeah, exactly.
If house as organism has a healthy immune system, then and that is interactive. But I like in the book that you do explore step one, if people haven't done that because they've hung some crystals or put some salt somewhere, or hung some herbs in a window or whatever. Is go, well, did I begin this process with some form of country acknowledgement and a kind of checking in with spirits of place and how I'm doing it? And that layer thing is good, because what you are warding with the house is an intersection. It's relational between you and the more than human world, which includes spirits of place and the dead and so on. So it's about providing that coherence, and I really enjoyed that kind of like exploration of what. What a practitioner place looks like, I suppose, or should.
Yeah, and you can't just shut it off like a hermetically sealed environment, because at least from a witchcraft perspective, it's also your temple. It's the place where the spirits come and go, and it seldom-ish, some witches might have a working space, but it's usually quite integrated into the physical environment. There's a lot of magic that takes place at the hearth and around those things, so it can't prevent spirits coming into your house. Like, it would be a spiritually active environment, but as you say, it has an immune system of its own, and the spirits that do frequent that house tend to throw out people who shouldn't be there, and over time it gets stronger, I think, the longer you inhabit a place, and it takes on its own natural momentum.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a good chat. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for doing this in person, kind of neighbour, We're south of Hobart Club.
Yeah.
That's good.
Thank you for encouraging me.
No, absolutely. Yeah, to be fair, there was some bullying, I'm not going to lie. In terms of, for people who want to know more, give us your books and where they can find you or them and whatever online. For people who are listening going, I'm into this is my jam. Where do they go to find out more about you and your books, Lee?
Well, if you look up Lee Morgan, traditional witch in brackets, to differentiate me from the other Lee Morgans, you'll find my Amazon author page is probably the easiest way to find my books. I do have a website, but I haven't actually got off the top of my head my URL. But you could find me on Facebook as well pretty easily. And
this will all be
in links.
Absolutely, this will all be in the show notes. So once Lee remembers the URL of his own goddamn website,
so good at promoting.
We'll make sure that's there as well. But thank you very much. This was a fun chat. I love in-person chats. This was good. It was a really great afternoon all round at Lee's place, actually. Not just this chat we recorded, but also touring around his property and sort of swapping notes on blended regenerative animist plans, I guess, and how, given we have similar cultural backgrounds, something like interaction with country works out for him in, I guess, even more similar post-colonial contexts. And it's just generally really encouraging to find the others, if you will, and interact with them and have really good, nice, deep chats with people whose heads are in similar places to, I know, where many of ours are. So some really good stuff in this discussion, and definitely useful food for thought for those also reconfiguring, I almost want to say, baseline praxis, like dreaming and inhabitation in this improving metaphysical and political model. And so if you're keen to know more, be sure to check out the show notes for links to Lee's various books. Of course, subscribe to the show. Let me know what you think on Facebook or at runesoup.com, and find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.